Picture this. You're sitting there, all alone, in your bedroom. It's a dark and stormy night. You know you should have gone to bed hours ago, but the quiet nature of solitude mixed with the steady patter of rain outside and the rhythmic tapping of a tree branch against your window lull you into a state of groggy complacency. The glow of your laptop screen is inviting you to stay just a little while longer, refreshing the page to see what else might pique your interest. And something does. A blank screen with a wall of small white text that tells the story that feels uncannily familiar. It talks to you directly, points out how everyone else in your house went to bed hours ago, how you know you shouldn't have stayed up late. You have a long day tomorrow, but this story warns of a different reason why you should have turned in. It says that those familiar sounds you've grown comfortable with are trying to trick you, and that whatever you do, do not look outside your window, because that's not a tree branch tapping on the glass. What would you do next? What I just recounted to you was a prime example of an early creepypasta. In short, a bite-sized horror story written for and posted on the internet. Many of these stories were posted anonymously, shared around on message boards, written to grab the attention of most any reader that may stumble across it. The intended effect of these stories was to put the reader in the shoes of the subject, sometimes with the aforementioned second-person POV, if they wanted to be blunt. But these simple scares brought about by accessibility to the digital age naturally evolved into more complex stories. Original characters, fleshed out plots and backstories, implementing images and video that existed on the internet and could be found by anybody. These stories were fictional, oftentimes extremely over the top and designed to shock and gross out. But many of the best and longest lasting stories all have the same shared element, the illusion of artifice. I mean, just look at where I'm standing right now. Everything behind me is a green screen, and this campfire glow is just a looping video on a laptop screen. But my presentation made you believe it was real, if only just for a moment. Looking directly at the concept of creepypasta, the artifice is inherently there. The horror contained within the story is separated from you by not just a computer screen, but probably thousands of miles and wires and digital code. But still, everything in that story you may be curious about, a strange and grainy sighting of a creature, an unsettling and inexplicable YouTube video, are within your reach within just a few clicks. You know you're safe, but still you can dance with danger at any point. And that means that it can reach you too. That was the appeal of creepypasta, what got so many kids and teens, including myself, into this world. And over the last 15 years and some change, I've watched the community grow and shrink, seen the format evolve into new forms, and emerge into the real world to become bigger than it originally was designed to be. I want this essay to be a somewhat comprehensive breakdown of the creepypasta genre, but not a history lesson. I've seen many videos from so-called internet historians who simply hop on the bandwagon to throw the stories into a tier list, or recap a handful of stories under a "remember this" title and thumbnail. Some essayists approach things by talking about the community aspect, or how cringeworthy and poorly written a lot of the stories are in retrospect, or the real-world effect of particular stories. But the truth of the matter is how all of these aspects influenced each other. I, as such a longtime fan, am a dwindled-down part of that fandom that persists. And so I want to talk about creepypasta as a community, as I knew it, what generally made it so distinct from other forms of horror, why it mattered to me, and where we go from here. I'd also like to point out the fact that I am a 27-year-old man ranting on the internet about 15-year-old stories intended for an audience of children, so it's not the most important thing in the world. I've unironically dressed up as Jeff the Killer and Slender Man for Halloween events. I'm doing this because I care, so please don't take any of this criticism to heart. The origin of the term creepypasta is a lot simpler and less interesting than you'd think. Branching off from early internet chain letters, online users would sometimes take large blocks of text and copy and paste into different chat forums, for the sole purpose of annoying or angering anybody that came across them. The absurd nature of some of these text blocks turned them into their own early form of a meme. The more you saw one, the more widely recognized it was as a farcical piece of fiction. Modern common examples include the Navy SEAL threat chain and the "to be fair, you have to have a really high IQ to understand Rick and Morty" thing. This became known as a copypasta because of how some stories were copied and pasted across the internet. As is human nature, people were eventually drawn to the realm of horror, and whether through curiosity or superstition, started passing on small, scary stories in the same vein, spinning off this meme format into its own subgenre of horror, the creepypasta. These stories were later compiled on a website called CreepyPasta.com, started in 2008 by a 23-year-old girl known only online as Sarah. This website also became a collaborative front, where users were invited to post their own original stories, although through a screen of moderators. But I'm almost positive that if you've at all dabbled in this fandom, you didn't first experience creepypasta by learning the etymology of its name, saw how it formed in chat groups and thought, yeah, that's a hobby I'd like to pursue. I doubt you started with the classics from the beginnings of Ted's Caving Page and read all the way up to the back rooms. No, I bet it snuck up on you, caught you off guard, and it captured your authentic in-the-moment reaction. I'll tell you my first experience, embarrassing enough, was through a Minecraft mod showcase, if that dates me well enough. I was a kid who was always predisposed to liking horror, and the thumbnail featuring these spooky, blocky creatures piqued my interest. As with any new hobby, I had to work my way backwards to get caught up. The only real clue I got from Skydas Minecraft was the mod's central new item, the computer, because, quote, all creepypastas come from a computer. I got introduced to a few of the big mascot stories with popular creepypasta characters. I wanted to learn more about these things, and so I started doing some of my own research. Going straight from Skydas Minecraft's video, I went to the top of the YouTube search bar, and I just typed in eyeless Jack and press enter. The top result had a thumbnail of the original image with the straightforward title, eyeless Jack. It was just 5 minutes long and was uploaded by a channel named Mr. Creepypasta. Upon clicking the video, it just booted up the image. It started playing really compressed piano music, and a guy with this very warm, high baritone voice said, "Hi, my name's Mitch, and this is something that happened to me a couple weeks ago." I, knowing nothing in regards to what creepypasta was, thought this was the source of the stories. In each video would be some other person's narration of a quote-unquote true story that happened to them. Obviously, I was thinking too narrow-mindedly, and I quickly picked up on the fact that this was just a narration channel, reading the stories in character. I don't know what precisely did it for me. Maybe it was the amateurish quality of the audio and the bare-bones presentation, giving it this feeling of authenticity. Maybe it was the fact that the story was so to the point and left off so eerily and conclusively. Or maybe it was this unsettling yet somehow melancholic music underscoring it all. But I became really invested in learning about this unique world of horror. These stories could apply to anybody because they were so vague and generalized. It was like a friend talking to you, and it mimicked the feeling of sitting there with someone, taking everything in as truth. I never really got that experience of an older brother showing me totally real pictures of ghosts caught on camera, and you can only fall for the jump scare highway video or the scary maze game one time each. But now, I could chase those feelings elsewhere. See, this was also during the period of the late 2000s where studio horror movies were just churning out cheaply produced slop. Pointless reboots, slashers, gore films adjacent to Saw, PG-13 mush watered down to appeal to the widest general audience, all mixed with overly flashy editing, an aggressive color grade, and weak characters. So little about this era was substantive that it felt like the horror genre was folding in on itself. The nature of the medium itself was partly to blame for the well seemingly running dry. Horror in traditional mediums is the product of an established art form, and therefore demands structure, resolution. There's a weight of expectations placed on bigger budget projects. Audiences want to see the monster. They want characters with meaning and depth, a level of investment. These things must be adhered to. And so they are forced to put up this wall of artifice and security between the story and the audience. Sure, some films like The Blair Witch Project, the VHS series, and The Ring all successfully recaptured those feelings of ambiguity, unease, and authenticity. But why those specific films were praised was for the ways they deviated from the norm, how they emulated something more underground, non-traditional. But I think it's finally time to break down what exactly these stories had to offer that made them so special. I should probably start by introducing all the main sources for stories from around this time, the narrators. The one I stuck with the longest was, of course, Mr. Creepypasta, an avatar of a big blue bald man without a shirt, and a mask connected by tubes going into his body. His style was very character-driven, and he emphasized different inflections. He voiced characters in different ways. He was very theatrical. He got to start primarily as an archive channel, just narrating stories from the main website in his spare time. As there was this threat of the servers being taken down, he built up a community that way, but was still largely just doing whatever stories he felt like. I eventually fell upon two creators at about the same level as MCP, who sort of made up the big three of the creepypasta community. They each had their own narration style, and different types of stories they preferred, but collaborated semi-frequently on bigger projects and during special events like Halloween. The second of the big three was CreepyPasta, a British narrator whose avatar was a man with long black hair covering his face, wearing a suit and tie, with a Pikachu mask fixed to his face. None of these guys like to reveal their faces. The music he picked was a lot more classical, calming, and his narration style was much more like someone narrating an audiobook. Very straightforward, without a lot of inflection. He always spoke in a calm way and billed himself as the comfort horror narrator. His stories were often very long and drawn out, with big expository dumps and flowery language. And the third of the trifecta was a guy named CreepyPasta Jr., a guy with a gravelly deep voice who was obviously a young adult or even a teenager at the start of his channel, whose avatar was a guy with crazy black hair, half his face covered with a black and red gas mask, and he was stuck in a straitjacket. He fell into a rhythm of reading either very short 5-minute micro-horror stories with usually cheesy twist endings, or Reddit no-sleep stories that felt copy and pasted after a while of encountering blank monster at place of business like a fast food restaurant parking lot at 3 a.m., and concluding they'll never go there again. His stories usually felt very samey in later years, but his horror stayed the punchiest for the longest with those little twists. There were other narrators that were either collaborators with the big three, or they were derivative offshoots that tried to capture that same style. A lot of smaller female narrators were most recognized for lending their mousy voices to the big group narrations. Madame Macabre, Miss Shadow Lovely, Kitten Reese Horror, Creeperoni, Creepy Mrs. Pasta, Dead Josie. Other male narrators stepped up to the plate, like Well Hay Productions, an older man named Murphy, who had a cartoon jester avatar, deep gravelly voice, and mostly just did collab work. And a couple younger guys with strong northern accents. Maple, CreepyPasta, focused largely on these really big multi-part stories, but talked slow and monotone, felt like an old school narration, with more modern story conventions. And ClancyPasta, who took the CPJ approach of Reddit stories based on mundane real-world horror with a twist, but they were often a lot longer, 20 to 30-minute stories that weren't being narrated elsewhere. It was a breath of fresh air. That goes without mentioning all of the other narrators that I just didn't listen to for some reason. King Spook, Mr. Nightmare, Corpse Husband, Scary Story Time with Liam, they all had their own personalities. But for one reason or another, their story selection just didn't reach me. Either it was strictly original stories, or smaller compilations of true stories. But of course there was Chilling Tales for Dark Nights, a very high production value narration team that was composed of several narrators. They had a very loud and effect-heavy title card, and always introduced each story before the narration started. They were never focused on immersion from the outset, removing background narration and major inflections, instead putting that into a very storyteller-type voices, and adding very well-produced music and sound effects. They covered much longer stories, audio dramas, and classic stories from authors like Edgar Allan Poe and H.P. Lovecraft. For how much content they put out, they rarely raked in the views from the start, but they're still around, doing just as much work. This was all brought together with a musical artist named Yuji, a German pianist who composed all sorts of original dark, melancholic piano music to underscore almost every narration from at least the big three narrators. He also composed original piano arrangements from several movie and game soundtracks like Silent Hill 2, 28 Days Later, Rammstein, and Dead Space 2. I also followed him to check out his new releases, and I get so excited when the narrators started implementing those new tracks into their stories right alongside the old tunes, even adding some orchestral pieces and ambient tones. He created the sonic landscape of this entire narrator community. The reason why I stuck with the narrators and channels and not the stories themselves, besides the undiagnosed ADHD and probably autism, but that's another story, was because of the added level of immersion. Eerie, mood-setting music and vocal inflections engrossed me. I met some of these guys in person, and that felt like such a thematic high point in the journey with these stories, to have it all validated, to achieve that sense of community in person, to break down that wall of artifice between the story and the audience. It was that feeling of togetherness that helped the CreepyPasta community flourish from early on. Not to mention these guys were propped up as curators, as opposed to the original website and the spin-off wiki where you could basically post anything regardless of quality. They vetted stories and narrated ones that they felt were worthy. The more views a story had, the more well-known and liked it probably was, I could surmise. There was an inherent level of trust. I consider the era of stories posted by the time I discovered these channels, about 2 to 3 years worth, to be the golden age, where all that was being uploaded by the big three channels was the classics, meant to preserve the staples of the medium, and whatever new stories were cropping up and gaining traction. The presentation was the same across the board. A single still image that also doubled as the thumbnail, eventually maybe adding the title, text, and the thumb, or a slightly unique picture, with compressed audio all overlaid with a few of Mew's compositions. As mentioned in an earlier section, this era was rife with shock horror and flash fiction. They cover practically any topic or subgenre of horror: dolls, hauntings, monsters, killers, psychological, technology, urban, rural, rituals, sci-fi, gore. But a majority of those got shuffled into a major category: internet horror, or urban legends involving some lost video, image, message board, etc. that might just be haunted or cause people to go insane. Examples include normalpornfornormalpeople.com, suicidemouse.avi, and Mariana Mordecai Glescarf. This naturally spun off into tangential media. These stories were usually short, poorly written, and banked on all sorts of scary and disturbing things going wrong, with recognizable lost episodes of kids' cartoons that featured disturbing deaths, hyper-realistic blood, characters breaking the fourth wall, and some prophesized future warning that's yet to happen. Examples include Dead Bart, Cupcakes, and Squidward, Red Mist. One story of this batch did stand above the rest: Candle Cove, an original story which took the form of an internet chat room where people discussed an old local kids' puppet show they used to watch. as they slowly remember all the oddities about the show, including unsettling character designs, nightmare-like episodes where all the characters just screamed, and the final revelation from a poster's mom that explained that there was never a show called Gamble Cove, and that every time he went to watch it, he just tuned the TV to static and watched dead air for 30 minutes. Probably my favorite variant of the twisted childhood IP subgenre was the video game creepypasta. This is where, more often than not, authors would create supplemental material pulling from ROM hacks to tell original stories of how a bootleg copy of a game glitched out on them, told them how they're gonna die, and maybe had the characters come out of the screen to varying levels of quality. Examples include Sonic.exe, NES Godzilla, and so many Pokemon hacks. Other stories took liberties with original games that were lost to time, generally simple premises that saw players be driven insane by some cryptic, inaccessible final level of a kid's spelling game, Mr. Mix, unleash a demonic entity on accident, i.e. Rap Rat, or be unnerved by small changes after repeatedly walking down the same hallway in the theater, which clearly had some baked-in appeal. Don't you think? One story in particular was called Been Drowned by Jay Deuceable. It had the familiar trappings of a video game pasta, but it rose above it. It was a complex and ongoing story about a cursed cartridge of The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask, and had accompanying footage of the glitching game itself. But notably, it stood out due to how intricate the story became. The cartridge itself seemingly haunted by the spirit of a young boy named Ben, who appropriately drowned. He's simply trying to tell his own story through glitching visuals and altering text. But that soon spirals into online chatbot conversations, secret cults, psychosis, and what was absolutely one of the most fleshed out early internet ARGs. That ties into my first real introduction to the era, the Pasta Monsters. Original creepypasta characters with backstories and lore that invited readers to create their own offshoot stories. Some examples include the Seed Eater, which was about a monster who convinced the protagonist to sacrifice kids to keep itself young. Jeff the Killer, the probably most famous story about a teenager who removed his own eyelids and carved a smile into his face and became a serial killer. Smile Dog, which was the haunted image about a grinning Siberian husky that acted like a classic chain letter, encouraging people to spread the word. There was the Rake, which was a pale humanoid creature that climbed through people's windows and sat at the edge of their bed, as told through compiled personal accounts. And of course, Eyeless Jack, which told the story of a guy who woke up to the creature standing over his bed, and it later stole one of his kidneys, as told to him by the very unconcerned doctor. These stories were filled with contrivances and shoddy writing, but they were original. And there were tons of little stories told from the second-person POV, written as a note to whoever found the story, how you were not alone, after all, planting the idea that there were monsters out there hiding in the dark. Examples include You're Not Scared Right, Windows, and That's Not Your Friend. This is where I first noticed the true potential of creepypasta as a storytelling medium. Beyond the hyper-realism and the immersion of urban legend-inspired formats. They didn't require finality, resolution. Updates on an ongoing story could be left in the middle of it to never be picked up again, and what you're left with becomes all the more horrifying. There are a few stories that were the actual ones I stumbled across after that fateful reading of Eyeless Jack. I started by just clicking on recommended videos. Not wanting to just sit there and stare at a still image for too long, I picked videos that were shorter, between 6 and 7 minutes. Teddy, which was about a haunted doll, Autopilot, about how one lapse in judgment caused catastrophic real-world consequences for a father, The Girl in the Photograph, an urban legend about a girl holding up 2 fingers on a Polaroid, which is revealed to be your kill count after the person who discovers the photograph is killed in a car accident, and the photo changes to show the girl holding up 3 fingers. There were dozens of stories like that. Punchy and effective, never staying longer than their premise required, and not requiring any sort of thematic depth. I started moving up to longer stories, roughly 20 to 25 minutes, which told bigger, more character-rich stories while still keeping that punchy feeling. Hands was about teenagers playing a game to make themselves pass out, when one accidentally goes too deep and makes a connection with the plane of the dead, and gets abducted in the middle of the night. Or Abandoned by Disney, about an urban explorer investigating a desolate fictional Disney amusement park, and discovering something they locked up, that they never wanted to get out. Or The Showers, a 3-part saga of a kid who was obsessed with urban legends, tracking down one his high school teacher told him about, only to find there's much more truth to it than he could have imagined. Or The Strangest Security Tape I've Ever Seen, about a guy watching security tapes at his gas station, where suddenly he starts to see his coworker behave in supernatural ways, getting him caught in a time loop. Others include Mr. Widemouth, about a young boy with mono that becomes friends with a Furby-like creature that in retrospect, he realizes was trying to get him to hurt himself. Or The Art of Jacob Emery, a very original cautionary tale about a man who grows drunk on power after finding a magic pencil that makes his drawings come to life. And he eventually learns exactly why he shouldn't break the barrier between himself and the art on the page. Or The Russian Sleep Experiment, which recounted a mad science experiment that kept a group of participants awake for days in a locked room as they slowly started to go insane. That one's pretty goofy. Every new story was something I'd never seen before in another medium. Not in that exact way. I think about these stories a lot because, obviously, this community meant a lot to me growing up. both as a means of escapism and inspiration for creative writing. This was easily accessible horror, with fresh and limitless possibilities since they weren't confined to a rigid narrative format, and I could build up a connection with these narrators, who I heard across a vast array of stories as they inhabited different roles, much stronger than I could get from a standard horror movie protagonist. A lot of my favorite stories around this time fell into one of a few different categories. For example, a lot of monster-focused stories had this really overpowering sound design, much more than typical narrations. They told stories of tall, lanky creatures pushing a farmer's hay bales to the perimeter of his property, but by the time he realizes that it's actually creating a cage, it's too late. Or the classic tale of a couple that encounters a group of ominous figures at the rest stop of a road trip that seems to follow them down the road. Or teenagers getting up to mischief in a haunted house on a camping trip, where they are piecing things together in real time and we're not given many concrete answers as to what's going on. Some other stories were great at using this new medium to its fullest, taking advantage of the internet format to riff off of technological anomalies, or writing the story in the form of an archived internet message board. Some of the best stories really took advantage of the freedom writing a story on the internet could provide, leading to some really original premises that are still untouched in most professional horror spaces. Historical incident reports about towns that vanish as a fissure in the earth opens and blacks out the sky. Scientific experiments involving horrors about the unknown, as subjects communed with God after removing all their senses, only to realize that he abandoned them. Or unique story worlds where everything is dictated by invisible strings pulling people along without free will. Or they just use the written word as a tool to disguise twists like how the main character is obviously dead the entire time, or that the story is written from a dog's point of view. There were really gripping longer stories with strong human elements, about children being abducted by a monster in the woods, and the protagonist's eventual mission to rescue their friend. Or twisted Nazi experiments that mutilated several children at an orphanage in order to learn how to live forever. Or a person learning about a mysterious ability that turns their finger guns into a weapon of destruction. These stories were fresh, and were a great jumping off point for lots of aspiring writers. A lot of stories had that distinct urban legend vibe, usually told in a casual voice, as if you were speaking around a campfire, or with a subject matter that was very vague, leaving a lot of room for interpretation. The settings were simple: woods, abandoned places, haunted houses, and the stories were punchy and inconclusive, creating this eerie feeling to leave the reader with. They felt like they could happen to anyone, should they go to the wrong place at the wrong time. Kids learning they shouldn't be exploring the woods or snooping through old homes, or tales that seem totally believable, like you could go there and see for yourself. A shack on a railroad track that seems to be home to a cryptic snuff film, with all the clues leading to more questions than answers. Or a haunted bridge that was once the site of a grisly murder thanks to an escaped convict. Or a terrifying encounter on a bus or a highway exit that seems to exist out of time. Or just with a silent, smiling man on a dimly lit sidewalk. There were bite-sized original tales with flashy little premises and a quick scare at the end. They feature stories of slowly progressing nightmares of someone approaching the dreamer's home, or kids discovering meeting stones for the dead out in a large field. Some gross-out stories focused on body mutilation, and others just had a good hook, like a security guard catching someone on his feed, stalking him, and only realizing it was on a delay when it was too late. Others were formatted more like rituals, with all sorts of eerie and vague instructions that would ideally see you conjure a spirit to haunt a doll, or invite a demon to chase you until you entered a protective circle. Some of my favorite stories were compiled in these annual reboots MCP and CPJ would put together, which featured a variety of unique premises, classic story settings, and overall just very memorable narrations. Comical how-to guides about surviving all these aforementioned stories monsters, stories of people outrunning monsters they've locked into contracts with, or adolescent appeal like kids surviving killers and ghosts when getting up to trouble in abandoned places at night without supervision. It just felt immersive, like you were part of these stories too. Speaking of, CreepyPasta Jr. had been releasing lots of large multi-part series at this time, as well as considerably longer individual stories, mostly creature features in domestic settings, exploring haunted abandoned buildings, but there were some really interesting tales of trains that led to a place between realities, or a group of friends uncovering a series of tapes made by a serial killer. MCP also had a few standout series of his own, multi-part tales that were extremely well written and heavy to sit through. These were stories about a guy looking back on his childhood, putting the pieces together of how a mysterious man had been stalking him his whole life. Or a man's diary as he slowly starts to go insane while locked in his own apartment, thinking the world outside had been overtaken by some virus. Other stories focused on this historical report of a twisted play that had become its own form of urban legend. And this supernatural detective story which saw Seattle PD, Ryan and Anna, sifting through a series of videotapes in order to find a sadist demonic entity that took sick, giddy pleasure in mutilating its victims. And this block of stories is where I first got introduced to MCP's 13 Days of Halloween Countdown, where he ramped up his video schedule to a nearly 2-week marathon, matching thumbnails, featuring a new story every day, including some really long and elaborate ones with collaborations, with some of my favorites taking place on or around Halloween, with stories of uncanny-looking monster children showing up at someone's doorstep, quote, dressed as humans. Or a classic setup of a group of college kids trying to survive in an abandoned mental hospital after accidentally summoning a demon. Or a man's slow realization that his neighbor is turning into a nightmarish monster, and that his yard decorations might be a little bit more realistic than he thinks. Even as far back as the Golden Age, these story formats were not a monolith. I could see more creativity in 3 stories here than I could go find in a year's worth of new horror movies. I was deep into the community at this point, and I wanted more. The Silver Age is the era where I first hopped on, roughly from 2012 to 2015, where I noticed a slow shift in the types of stories that were being narrated. The channel stopped covering exclusively CreepyPasta, and they just became beacons for horror stories in general. MCP started collaborating with regular authors. Thumbnails got more deliberate, usually with the title big and bold across the center, and the average video length got longer. The medium was evolving. Audiences demanded meatier stories, and the channels delivered a healthier balance of plot and character-heavy tales, with the simpler, punchy twist-ending scares. And probably the best feature of this era is that CreepyPasta still retained its freedom. Stories could be about anything, spread off from any subgenre, play with their own structure in interesting ways. These stories, despite getting more structure, maintained the appeal of the medium. One of the first things I noticed about this time was when MCP started featuring specific authors on his channel, and mentioning them by name in his titles. The one I remember the most was Vincent V. Cava, a guy who was mostly known for either punchy stories with big twists, or longer stories that felt more substantial and followed a beated plot. He was most recognizable for his heavy comedic overtones, or his frequent use of elaborate similes that usually came out of nowhere. A lot of his protagonists were morally gray, often bitter and tended towards violence, feelings of spite, cheating, lying, and didn't have a lot of otherwise amiable attributes. Some longer stories, for instance, focused on people attempting rituals with dangerous occult entities through a mirror in a game of question and response. Or a man making a deal with the devil who comes to him in the form of a huckster kid with a penchant for bad jokes, who helps him kill his adulterous wife. Or a boy recruited by a supernatural creature to take someone's life in exchange for the creature saving his father's, and living with the guilt of that. Or a snarky clean freak college student who murders his fat oaf of a brother and roommate and systematically disposes of the body by throwing it into a lake, where he soon goes insane and starts hallucinating talking bugs. MCP shifted his content to include a healthy mix of longer 20 to 30 minute stories and shorter 5-minute scares. I regularly revisit these longer standalone stories, as their length is great for background listening, on top of the fact that the stories were legitimately cool. These were more stories than things you could pass off as urban legends or campfire stories. They were heavy with prose, experimenting with real story structure and real thematic setup and payoff. Stories range from supernatural encounters with monsters in woods or demonic entities looking to make a deal at a crossroads, to sci-fi psychological thrillers involving dreams or imaginary friends, to man-made horrors like men going insane or sociopaths looking to satisfy their urges, and more unsettling ones like child murderers, whether supernatural urban legends or intruders infiltrating a children's game in the pitch dark. Adulterers, abandoned churches, and ancient underground temples that became the site of a cult ritual, to supernatural stories of entities invading everyday life, from the garden to a crawl space in a tiny apartment to an old English village. This is where I heard some of my favorite high-concept stories, like a haunted house that twists with each new room to become a sort of personal hell for the participant, using everything from a room with no shadows, to a recreation of his home filled with the visits of his dead family, to him literally having to kill a version of himself to get free. Or a detective's investigation into a teen's disappearance, finding a link to an ancient Japanese ritual embedded in a piece of technology. I got to experience my first 13 days of Halloween countdown in real time, and this year CPJ joined in on the fun with a countdown of his own. This is also when MCP and CPJ started doing a separate spring break spooktacular, which was another marathon in March or April of 7 days straight of new stories, which were usually a lot shorter but culminated in 1 or 2 big fan-requested stories, or stories that would become some of my favorites. Stories ranged from supernatural rituals tied to technology that turned into a game of sacrifices and backstabbing, to unique creature features in strange settings, nursing homes, over message boards, to people being driven to insanity by voices taunting them on the phone or in their own dreams, either by supernatural or psychological means, or dread-inducing sci-fi concepts of destroyed worlds, where you watch the Earth die safely from orbit and have no easy choice on what to do next, or innocuous horrors existing in our own world beyond our comprehension. CPJ's approach to the Spooktacular was a bit different, each day publishing a short 5-minute story that he'd written himself, that was always framed as the setting of kids encountering something creepy while on spring break, i.e. a stranger at the door, a stalker on the way home from a party, nothing too memorable. But he did write them himself, so that's commendable. There were also several Christmas-themed stories that were typically just standard horror stories but set in a snowy cabin, or around Christmas time that helped paint a picture of a very unique setting. CreepyPasta Jr. also had a few standout stories, filling in the gaps from MCP's shift in content, by focusing squarely on shorter stories, with usually between 5 to 10 minutes that were reliant on punchy setups, high concepts, and one big twist that typically brought out the horror element of the story. I.e., the apocalypse started, I have a bunker full of canned food, but no can opener. Or, the narrator was a bad guy the entire time? Or just some ironic or scary succumbing to your own demise. There are also some longer stories that were able to flesh out their high concepts. Stalkers, immersive sci-fi worlds involving supernatural killers hopping between dimensions, people stuck in computer simulations slowly coming to that realization, and generally creepy stories using rural backroads as a means of adding a sense of mystery, either home to supernatural monsters or chilling rituals. But maybe my favorite narration of his told the story of a man seemingly communicating with his deceased girlfriend through recycled chats in his Facebook messages with her, and her tagging himself in the background of some of his photos, which used the medium to its fullest by showing all of this in accompanying screenshots. CreepyPasta's output was generally unremarkable, save for his unique presentation. Whenever I listened to one of his stories and really enjoyed it, it was either a really calming rendition of a typical creature feature, some high-concept story revolving around some sci-fi elements in an otherwise normal world, or really long entries that dragged out these horrifying, depraved tales of the worst of humanity hidden behind the veil of a children's TV show. Real-life psychological and physical horrors like murderers, abusers, cults, and amateur science experiments, all taken with the same approach, editing style, and vocal inflection. At least you knew what you were getting. Some of my favorites included a multi-part, decade-spanning odyssey about an old naval ship that was haunted by a mysterious creature, or a call center employee that gets dozens of bizarre phone calls from seeming spirits from a resort lost in an explosion decades ago. Also becoming part of my regular rotation around this time was Chilling Tales for Dark Nights, which I've already mentioned, and honestly that's about as in-depth as I can get about their style and content. Notable stories I remember include Plot Holes, My Last Camping Trip, Off the Beaten Path, Long Fingers and the Children of the Snow, Hand of the Loa, Mayhem Mountain, Sarah O'Bannon, Truck Stop Horror, Tulpa Tree, Scarecrow Corpse, and all sorts of classic Lovecraft and Edgar Allan Poe stories. However, there was one story in particular that always stood out to me. A 4-part series that just ran over an hour called Danny's Story, and told 4 little vignettes of a washed-up guy encountering paranormal entities that stood outside his porch that spoke to him in familiar voices. Himself as a kid, his dad, ex-lovers. They taunted him and begged him to let them in. He was a shady guy, and his internal monologue slowly revealed more about his past, and showed that he'd been traumatized by something his father did as a kid, and he clearly had an uncaring attitude towards women. In the end, the creatures get into his house. They're the corporeal visages of women he'd murdered and cut off their feet so they couldn't run, hence why he always saw muddy handprints on his front porch. The narration was so well done, with such layered sound effects and some of the eeriest voice work whenever the entities were taunting him, using all sorts of pitch distortions and creepy throat sounds to help make them sound more inhuman. It's one of my absolute favorites and I encourage you to check it out. And as for MCP's shorter 5 to 10 minute videos, they were geared more towards tighter, leaner stories that focus mainly on the scares or the introduction of a premise. They were punchier, easier to get into, and a lot of them still carried on that casual, conversational, campfire story voice. Like the Golden Age videos, they similarly tackled a wide range of topics, everything from supernaturals to demons and rituals, to human stalkers and necrophiliacs, to mysterious, unknowable entities lying in wait, to grounded tragedies of lost children and societies of limited means that demanded sacrifice, to human experiments and unearthed footage of abandoned theme parks, sci-fi and high-concept stories about mannequin revolts and mysterious phone numbers that promise a vague remodeling service, or a little girl who could hear the sounds of hell thanks to her dead twin sister. There was one author featured heavily on MCP's channel called I Post at Midnight. They almost exclusively wrote flash fiction, little 5-minute stories that usually ended with a sick twist, or they were little bite-sized explorations of an idea or horror concept, i.e. a man trapped in a maze with death traps at every turn, and no clue which way to turn first. Or a reimagining of hell being an office job, where everybody wrote down different tortures, and the winner got the night off from enduring said torture. Or a haunted building that traps you on a perpetual staircase, no matter how far up or down you go. These tiny stories by him and a collection of unknown authors are like potato chips to me. I can't listen to just one. I think of one and I want to go watch them all back to back. The Bronze Age is the start of when things started to really blur together for me. As my life got busier, uploads got longer, and I started to pare down how much creepypasta I was watching. This was between 2015 and 2017, roughly, and I was in between high school and college, where I had my friends, my relationship, and this just took a backseat. I dropped creepypasta completely, thinking he was getting a bit monotonous, and CreepyPasta Jr. was on his way there, only having a few odd and great memorable stories every couple months. But the storytelling got a lot more adult here, using more flowery, descriptive language, playing up dramatic horror elements, and not reading as much like they came from amateur or young writers, just putting their stuff out there on the internet. There were several memorable high-concept stories, about as many as kind of forgettable, overly drawn-out slogs that bask in their own self-importance. This batch of stories, the ones I remember at least, almost entirely came down to the videos for MCP. CreepyPasta's output around this time was becoming very generic, and MCP was regularly releasing 30 to 40 minute videos with high concepts and heavy stories, which I'd gotten accustomed to over the last couple years. This crop featured a couple returning favorites like Vincent V. Cava, as well as some new authors that produced some really interesting premises, i.e. a seemingly supernatural doctor helps a guy looking to quit smoking by giving him these pills, only for the guy to slowly turn to ash. Or a group of college kids taking this experimental drug that triggers waking dreams, only to realize they can't escape, and they can see the dead still living amongst them. There are more somber stories, like a boy whose imaginary friend was the ghost of a stillborn baby that grew more into a real person over time and became jealous. Or a boy being forced to talk to his dead brother, who weakly communicated through his corpse about this truly unnerving blank void of an afterlife he was experiencing. Or a man reuniting with the visage of his dead wife in the form of a trickster creature. Or a twist on the zombie apocalypse story where the return were children, the victims of abusers and killers, and they came back just to get revenge. It really laid out how a whole society would likely look the other way in this instance. There are more stories about haunted houses that took the form of your worst fears, or siblings' creepy interactions with ghosts through a radio that may or may not have been who they hoped they'd been talking to. Or creepy hidden areas in Disney attractions, and even a story about a man discovering a bar that was a secret entrance to hell, that served him drinks like despair and regret, and he saw things and learned things about his life he should never have known. There are stories of demons walking amongst normal people and challenging a church congregation to a test of faith, or miscellaneous stories I really enjoyed that harked back to an old urban legends around campfires, or told of grandparents passing on their regrets of troubling themselves with the things they didn't understand. There were also some very long, very needlessly drawn out stories in this bunch that either were too simple in premise to justify their runtime, or the bulk of the story was descriptive lines, which was something I was noticing a lot more at this point. There was a new batch of tales from a new writer called Unsettling Stories, who wrote almost exclusively about grotesque body horror, either real-world issues that could affect anybody like sex acts gone wrong, or sci-fi gore that involved mushroom parasites overtaking human hosts and animalistically reproducing, to the point of damaging the host. However, there was one series that transcended all of this noise, and it was part of MCP's Halloween special this year, sometime after I started college. Borrasca. The Halloween countdown starting around this time felt less special for some reason. Interstitial videos that separated the little on-camera skits like you usually do, which just clogged up my subscription feed, longer stories that all started to read as the same type of thing with different skins. This was mostly down to his change in narration style and music choices. And to boot, 4 of his 13 days in his countdown were taken up by 4 chapters of the same story. A massive multi-hour in total story with a vaguely eerie name, each chapter totaling well over 45 minutes. It was daunting to find time on the nights that they released, but I liked the change of pace for the longer story, and the short and sweet title that didn't give anything away. What hooked me from the start was the heavy emphasis on scene description and character. It felt like a real story, with themes and twists of the narrative baked in from the start. It was so unlike anything I'd heard from this channel in at least a year. The story focused on a group of kids in a small mountain town named Drisking, Missouri. The protagonist, Sam, and his family had to move there when he was young after his father had, quote, done something bad in the police department and had to get reassigned. Once in town, he meets his 2 new best friends, Kyle and Kimber, 2 fiery redheads that were total opposites, cynical versus optimistic, stoner versus academic, etc. The story's prologue chapter focused on the group of kids exploring the forest area of the mountains, hanging out at a place called the Triple Tree, and sharing stories about the skinned men that haunted these woods, living at a place called Borrasca. In town, they met all sorts of shady characters like the town benefactor, a sleazy snake oil salesman type named Jimmy Prescott, and the old grumbling sheriff Killeen Cleary. The story kicked into gear when Sam's older sister suddenly didn't show up to school one day. She'd apparently run off to the woods with her new boyfriend, and she disappeared. She'd gone to the Triple Tree, and all the rumors as a kid swirled around to the skinned men abducting her and taking her to Borrasca. The story then jumps ahead 8 years or so, and sees the now teenage group of friends slowly starting to put the pieces together, and what they find is anything but the supernatural terror they feared as a kid. Every piece of terminology, every part of the legend, was a twisted children's misunderstanding of the truth, the town's shady past. It was a story about an entire town complicit in the abduction and impregnation of young girls in town and drifters from neighboring towns. They were trafficked up to a place in the mountains, inside a dry cave vein, aka a borrasca, which operated almost like a baby mill. The town was complicit because a collapsed mine decades ago caused the majority population of the town to become infertile, and so the Prescott family started up this heinous institution and started to supply the town with children, P names for Prescott, K children for the sheriff. After Kimber disappeared into the mountains when trying to find out more about her mom's sudden tragic suicide, the boys go up to rescue her and find the baby mill, as well as Kimber, and Sam's disappeared sister chained to beds. It's a tragic and violently disturbing story, but it's remarkable how every single piece of the puzzle fell into place. Every setup had a payoff, every little story element fed into the bigger picture. Sam is the only one to escape the mountain unscathed, thanks to his father's intervention in the investigation. An epilogue story that saw Sam and Kimber reunite 5 years later to take down the operation and rescue a disabled Kyle during the snowy winter would reveal just how involved Sam's dad was to the operation from the beginning. The story ends with Sam alone, addicted to drugs in a ratty Chicago apartment, when he receives a letter that was addressed by Kimber and contained her mother's suicide note, which detailed the truth of the entire operation. After I heard that story, I continued to chase the high I got hearing that nail-biting thriller for the first time. And since MCP's longer stories were more about high-concept stuff as opposed to deeper, character-rich stories, I started looking towards the shorter pastas to see what they could offer. And MCP had a few really standalone stories with neat concepts. Tragic ghost stories about mothers who died in a car wreck haunting a scout camp to retrieve milk from the fridge to feed their infant in a backseat. Or the ghost of a flirtatious woman haunting a man's apartment that he mistakes for her very much alive twin sister that happens to live across the hall. Or a boy sneaking out after curfew to tune into a drive-in theater radio broadcast signal to listen to Jurassic Park, only to hear mysterious interferences from some man that taunts him with phrases from his childhood. Other stories were just outright unsettling, leaning back into that early creepypasta unexplained ambiguity that made so many stories iconic. Like a summer camp instructor fighting a corpse tied to a cinder block in the middle of a deep area of a lake. Or a family meeting their new neighbors that always smiled and almost seemed like robots, and eventually started redecorating the entire inside and outside of their house to match theirs. Or just a simple recitation of a very disturbing crime scene. CreepyPasta Jr. had a few standout stories in this era. Breaking away from a standard 10-minute copy-paste Monster of the Week formula, he had some shorter stories that really harken back to the golden age urban legend stuff. Spectral figures visiting a man each night, bleeding out until the night he snaps, killing the man on sight, only to find out he's real that time. Or a legend involving a cryptic video game that made its way around a local trading scene that, when deciphered, revealed the location of a little girl's body buried in the ground, with all the elements of the game analogous to map directions and a confession of a murder weapon. His stories like this employed classic campfire tales techniques, and a bit of mystery, leaving some elements very much up to interpretation. You can tell just by my descriptions of the stories how much more complex and drawn out these stories could get, and that wasn't always a bad thing. But it was certainly different. Gone were the simple scares and boundless creativity, and in was a series of richer stories that can't easily hook a curious audience that has a spare 10 minutes, or that definitely couldn't be succinctly pitched to a friend. The medium was changing. The expectation for stories was changing. And to be frank, a lot of these stories were playing to an established audience that was growing up with the fandom. But as for the new blood, things were changing for how they got introduced to new stories in the first place, and what those new stories could even look like. In case it wasn't clear from that last era, I was growing more lukewarm. There comes a time in a teenager's life where they start to wean off of certain more adolescent trends. I was going to college, and I can remember distinctly that as the channels were entering a new age, I could see myself falling off the fandom. I also didn't like how things were changing. First of all, creepypasta.com and the wiki were floundering, whether it was due to internal issues with the fandom's acquisition of all fan wikis and the corporatization that took place, or it was just a shrinking core audience due to lack of interest. The creepypasta community saw a resurgence through the hellbeast of a website that is Reddit, thanks to the popular No Sleep subreddit, which gave you access to hundreds of stories randomly selected for you based on an algorithm and engagement that were recently posted, which was the new way anybody engaged with social media. The stories themselves were getting longer and more obtuse, the titles and thumbnails either getting more abstract, generic, or needlessly Reddit-y. It all just started to feel like noise. The best example I can think of is all the variations of never go to a Walmart parking lot at 3 a.m. A lot of that was thanks to the nature of the Reddit No Sleep page, which required authors submitting stories to 1. Stay in character, i.e. restrict it to a first-person point of view, and 2. Always include an in-universe reason as to how the story got uploaded to the internet, i.e. anybody could be writing this, and it doesn't have to be directly stated how or when, but the POV character can't die. Or if they do, there must be a footnote about how this block of text was recovered by police, or was uploaded by a killer or whatever. At first it seemed limiting with the types of stories that could be told. Jenny Nicholson, who, like always, put together probably the most pointed analysis of the fandom on this site, broke down how restrictive a storytelling subreddit where even the audience must stay in character, and having that be where most popular news stories were being pulled from now, turned all the big stories into the same thing. Maximizing engagement with long chapters, ongoing stories that felt like laying track in front of a moving train, and increasingly ridiculous premises or other outlandish clickbait titles that felt so much less immersive than the Golden or Silver Age stories, but still got a pass on a technicality. It felt like reading through 50 Shades as it was being published, one chapter after another, whichever ideas come to you with no need to revise or flesh it out. The stories had gone from being simple thrills to a healthy balance of that and dramatic heft, to stories that were trying to take themselves too seriously. They required too much of an investment up front. And so I saw myself not engaging with as many new uploads, being very selective with my time, and mostly just revisiting old favorites. I remember unsubscribing from the big three channels completely after a while. And I watched as the occasional recommended video would show up with some really long title and a convoluted thumbnail that was some generic horror monster / screaming woman / ghoulish figure stock photo that was deep fried with a Lightroom filter. I stopped caring, especially when those uploads from my favorite channels started to shift to no sleep, and self-contained stories started to look more like 5, 6, 7, up to 14-part series all in a row. It would take weeks before I started thinking of even seeing a fresh story, which hurt more if I was either too far removed from the start of a series to catch up, or if I didn't find it interesting in the first place. So many series around that time felt so homogenized, adopting this humorous, sardonic speaking voice to describe a series of disconnected, almost anthologies of different supernatural or just plain weird encounters, that all still insisted on maintaining realism by bringing up the fact that they're an ongoing story. This included everything from My Name is Lily Madwhip, to My Property Isn't Normal, to Infected Town Case Files, to the Neverglade Mysteries. I also noticed that the Halloween Countdown and Spring Break Spooktacular as I knew them had pretty much disappeared. Gone were the little skits and interstitials or unique matching thumbnails. Just ones that blended into the generic image and title template, just with a number hidden in the image, somewhere to show the day of the countdown. CBJ had taken a different approach, doing themed uploads of his regular schedule each week, where he'd just cover a certain genre like lost episodes or disappearances. The Halloween specials didn't feel like specials anymore. Halloween didn't feel like an event, especially since MCP was uploading almost every other day, and literally every day during the month of October. This modern age takes place roughly from 2019 to the present day, and was my reintroduction to the medium after a couple years of not listening regularly. This was much like how I was first introduced to CreepyPasta, not knowing anything about what I was stepping into, with years worth of a back catalog to sift through. It was during the early months of the COVID-19 pandemic. I just graduated college, I was looking for a job in a terrible market, and wanted something to listen to so the days would pass by faster. And I fell back in love with the community. Part of that was due to a series of few really great standalone stories, as well as me going out on a limb and finding longer, multi-hour series to play in the background. MCP really changed up his narration style, stepping closer to the microphone, speaking in a more candid, casual way that read less like a narrator and more like the character themselves recounting the story around a campfire. Still with the inflections and emphasis to highlight certain words or phrases for dramatic effect, it gave me the feeling of those original stories I loved so much again. I only started with a few stories, with simple titles that read like real short story titles, with some artistic craft. Lake Wake, about a funeral home worker who witnesses some paranormal events overnight, only for the tone to shift, more melancholic and sweet in the end. Basically Haunting of Hill House episode 6, no wonder I loved it so much. Or The Koresh, a really well-constructed urban legend story about a monster in the woods, but told with so much tension and mystery. Or Route 27, which basically broke down the very nature of urban legends and used really flowery language. Or The Hunt, a tense thriller about two brothers-in-law snowed in at a cabin, where one starts to get really trigger-happy as he accuses the other of sleeping with his wife. Or The Burned Photo, the newest saga from a guest narrator named Autumn Ivy, recounting the author's learning of a curse that's been haunting her family for generations. The mysterious ghost children that were responsible for infiltrating her home and making her brother vanish without a trace. These stories had intrigue, they had solid structure, like a real story with themes, and they gave me that same unsettled feeling I got when I first discovered the original videos. There were some really great stories that we only got in October. There were themes all around the Halloween season. Pumpkins, haunted houses, trick-or-treating. While I liked these stories from previous years much more, there were several stories in this era that really leaned into the atmosphere. And the writing style lent itself to more visual scene description, and I was able to paint clearer pictures of the stories. Despite No Sleep's rigid rules about staying in character and keeping things believable, these stories always veered into the more surreal and unbelievable premises more often than not. Just allowed it into this more grounded world from the start, which was a unique spin, to say the least. The Halloween stories focus specifically on things like this urban legend of a girl who was downright terrified of pumpkins, and this pumpkin monster, only to fall down a hill after being chased by a creature and snap her neck in a pumpkin patch. Or a live call line for a local access TV show, where a little boy dialed the number and heard a series of disturbing, almost customized pre-recorded scripts from the cast members. Or teenagers at a haunted house that eat candy that seems to turn them into flesh-eating monsters. There are a lot of stories about pumpkins. Just weird things about people being turned into pumpkins, pumpkins sealing away an ancient evil that stalked the streets of town that was released after some boys vandalized them, a giant collection of hormone-infused pumpkins that eventually killed a man thanks to his hubris, and, one of my favorites, the disturbing karmic revenge story of a man who poisoned kids as part of an occult ritual on his pumpkin farm on Halloween, who was dragged to hell by his victims the next year on the day. I really took to a small crop of single stories, focusing on everything from ghost stories tied to tragedy, to eerie technology-based stories that saw people trapped on the other end of something horrific, like witnessing a supernatural murder, or a mentally ill woman confessing to a crime as she's seemingly unwillingly committing it, or a timid girl writing her own stalker into reality, or the same concept for developers working on a horror VR game that seemed to create its own enemy character. Going off of that, a unique way some of this era's stories kept the original spirit of CreepyPasta alive was using no-sleep format restrictions to limit our understanding of the situation, by telling of a neighborhood that's slowly vanishing from existence from the perspective of a young boy, or a daughter who's only helpless to watch as the undead corpse of her father mindlessly taps away at his latest novel. Or fathers or general adults, unable to stop something nefarious that they don't seem to understand, that's targeting children, outside of their view and reach. There were stories about men turning violent due to bouts of insanity, either brought on by superstition or paranoia involving infidelity. And there were really high concept stories that hid their hand. Stories of a supernatural lottery that took their fair share in payment after unworthy winners squandered their earnings. Or a shady business that traps unsuspecting drifters and uses them as bait for an endangered species of spider to produce a certain silk that has, quote, natural health properties to help the rich and powerful live forever. Or a guy who helps guide lost spirits in the afterlife to get closure, often facing mutilated, gross amalgamations of things in their life that seek to block their way. Or a children's game of passing notes that gets interrupted when a mysterious new player starts writing and drawing disturbing images on the paper, cursing the kids to play forever. Or this amazing narration of a guy who starts communicating with an entity that can see the future, communicating only through text on his computer, as he followed its cryptic instructions to help him get ahead in life through a series of butterfly effect consequences. I also got attached to some parts of the longer stories, which I could just put on without having to switch between videos all the time. There I discovered a lot of anthology-style, semi-comedic stories that I enjoyed but didn't love, and couldn't really get into. One was the Habitsville series, about an investigative reporter tracking down all sorts of anomalies in town, ranging from mysterious fish at the bottom of the lake, or antique stores that trap you in a time loop, or a ballet performance that sets the lead character on fire at the end of every show. Unlike most of the short anthology story series, I like this one because of how varied the locations, characters, and genres tackled were. That wasn't the case for something like Tales from the Gas Station, which focused mainly on a single group of characters encountering strange phenomena in a dingy gas station, and largely turning up their nose to all of it, rolling their eyes at things like cults, extra-dimensional gods, disappearances, the spectral visages of cowboys singing in the bathroom, etc. are all completely normal. It just got exhausting, especially after about 30 parts of the story across 4 seasons. But I was able to find a couple really interesting, more serious anthologies, like I'm a Search and Rescue Officer for the US Forest Service, which covered all sorts of short anecdotes, usually compiled into bigger videos, from one guy's time spent in the woods tracking down missing kids, hikers, etc. Stories range from vaguely supernatural things like kids staying alive with no food for months, to a hiker inexplicably dying while stuck in a tree, with investigators unsure how he was able to get up there. Or women who supposedly talked about apparitions in the forest that were always watching, to realistic stories of hikers getting trapped in a snowbank or dad carrying his baby falling down a hill, snapping the baby's neck. Probably the most memorable stories involved the stairs, literal staircases that just appeared in the middle of the woods, that the narrator was always told to never climb up. The story was very naturalistic, written in a casual voice like it was being told by an old grizzled man around a campfire, and that's what was so unique about it. There was another one kind of like this called I Work for a Private Museum for the Rich and Famous, which was a series of weird and twisted stories about this supernatural museum with exhibits featuring anything from a woman who stuffed herself full of plastic gel to become a taxidermy statue, or a giant mutant fly creature called Beelzebub, or an invisible entity that drains children's life energy by making them go to sleep, or a talking monkey doll with symbols and a large grin that spoke in riddles and could tell the future. Another anthology that took a completely different approach was a whole reboot series to Jeff the Killer, which sought to take the story of edgy kid kills family and bullies and turn it into a real sprawling crime drama that studied the aftermath of Jeff's rampage and sudden disappearance. Edgy teens started dressing up as him, gave him his infamous nickname, and hung out on this abandoned strip of land. There were copycat killers, there were police officers set to investigate the larger mystery involving the kids, Jeff's bully Randy, who had since gone into witness protection, and the upcoming television appearance of Jeff's still alive brother Lou, who capitalized on the tragedy with writing a book, and the testimony of the only known survivor of Jeff's rampage, Jane Arkansas, aka Jane the Killer. It was a story that played around with the format, switching between sections of a police report, excerpts from a book, audio logs / news reports, and a large cast of characters, each with their own perspective. MCP would release a new chapter each Halloween at the end of his 13-day Halloween countdown for several years. There are a few stories that acted as one overarching tale, splitting across multiple semi-self-contained chapters, like I Dared My Best Friend to Ruin My Life, which was an epic, long-spanning story about a guy who systematically set out to increase the minimum effort of his friend, who became complacent in life. And he snapped, going as far as to kill, vandalize, and frame his friend for all of it. The story was grounded, realistic, starting off with small anecdotes of receiving tons of junk mail, having his email and password compromised, eventually leading to robbery. The protagonists got on the same level after a while, leading to a tense showdown between two equally insane men who were dead set on destroying each other. Another story, my family has been stalked for the past 4 years, clever title I know, was the story of a paranoid father who told a semi-realistic story of receiving loads of scary images, drawings, and videos from an unknown person, all addressed to his young daughter. He hid the evidence from his family, and eventually had to come clean after his daughter was kidnapped. He found her tied up in a barn, held hostage by a mentally disabled man who dressed in a clown mask, whose parents were pivotal members of the town, and had kept the entirety of the case a secret. But there were 3 standout stories that have now become my top 3 of all time. 4 to 5 hour epics covering such intricate and multi-layered stories that could not have been more widely different in tone and content. The first, surprisingly, is an installment in the Tales from the Gas Station series, a standalone story called Bedside Manor, which involved 2 of the main characters, Jack the straight man and Jerry the tall bumbling comic relief, getting stranded on a road trip and taking up shelter in a murder mystery themed bed and breakfast, full of a colorful cast of characters that were all meeting for the first time, including a blind old man who talked in pre-selected sentences and a little boy who was one bad moment away from snapping and turning into a serial killer. They were both forced to play along the game, which later becomes an actual murder mystery once the elderly hostess turns up dead on the ground. And just like the main series, what transpires is an insane series of events involving a time loop, multiple deaths and rebirths, a reanimated taxidermy polar bear, and a series of trap rooms and NPC characters. Like a detective, they always find a way to incapacitate early in the run to save on time. It all ends up being some simulation where they, and all the other characters, were being used as a fuel source for this insectoid, worm-like, extra-dimensional species trying to keep them stuck in a Matrix-like dreamscape. It was full of memorable one-liners, such distinct characters, vivid descriptions of wacky scenarios that all felt like a real step up for the series. I think all of that was due to the fact that the entire premise and cast had to be introduced to the reader up front, and so it really had to build its world up properly, establishing tension and forming character naturally. The second story was the start of a new series, titled Accounts from a Lonely Broadcast Station, which, although it already sounded derivative, I thought the setting was interesting. And imagine my surprise when I clicked on the first video, which had a distinct new song that would play the start of each new chapter. They set this mysterious yet upbeat tone, followed by the voice of a sarcastic woman with a sultry alto voice instead of the familiar MCP. This was guest host Autumn Ivy, and this was her spotlight series on his channel, which he provided additional voices for. The premise was simple. A journalism major fresh out of college named Evelyn McKinnon gets a job working as a broadcast engineer / DJ for a defunct radio station, 104.6 FM, for her foggy mountain town. She basically lives up there. She and her co-host, an overly chipper and naive failed theater major named Daniel Esperanza, slowly start to uncover a mystery involving disappearances, bodies in the woods, and a rolling fog that seems to bring in a series of amalgamate animals, fused together like Lovecraftian creatures, hell-bent on taking more sacrifices. Not only was it a killer premise with a great and distinct protagonist voice, but there was Hart. One of the missing people is Evelyn's college friend, who she lost touch with after falling into alcoholism, after seeing what looked like the visage of her dead father in the woods on a graduation campout. Those woods had haunted her for years, and got her locked down this path of loneliness and misery. But together with Daniel, they find a reason to keep going, as their roles become clear. They're watchers of the town, numbers 28 and 29 to be exact. They're responsible with everybody's safekeeping, and they find friendship, purpose, and confidence in each other. It's a harrowing 9-part story, with a 5-part sequel series that delves into the personal lives of the characters a bit more. And I absolutely went feral, even reading ahead with the actual story because I was so obsessed with many of the plot twists and turns, but saving the finale for the narration, just to hear Autumn Ivy's spectacular rendition. I got so attached to the characters, all of their little quirks, They're running jokes that made this feel like one complete body of work, like the recurring bird creature outside the window with human eyes. Finally, this was what the evolution of the genre was supposed to be. I didn't foresee the rest of the channel following suit, but it made me feel validated that the medium could reach these heights again. I felt like after all the ups and downs as I was getting into my upper levels of college, this was a great high note to leave CreepyPasta behind on. That wasn't until I came across this final story, which was something truly special. It was dark, mature, it was steeped in lore and built its foundations off of urban legends, history, and character relationships fleshed out in interstitial anecdotes that went back years. The world just felt lived in. This one story felt like a fully realized world in and of itself, full of complex and morally gray characters, real tragedy, strong themes of faith and grief and corruption. The story was called The Spire in the Woods, and it focused on the story of a teenage boy who was on the fringe of a group of people reeling from the loss of a boy at their school, Robert Edward Keenan, who took his own life by burning himself alive in his car. The fallout of that event involved a lot of grieving kids. Nathan Fletcher, Rob's best friend a couple of years older than the protagonist, who blamed himself for putting Rob on that path. Elena Aminev, a beautiful yet approachable track star that Rob had a borderline obsessive crush on, who some people had supposedly seen with him in the car before he committed suicide. And Scary Carrie Peterson, a tall, overweight goth girl that was even less popular than the protagonist. The crux of the story revolved around the protagonist and Scary Carrie being asked by Elena to investigate a cryptic line in Rob's suicide note. And every hour I see her face as she runs the endless race. This stemmed back to an old urban legend about something called the Widower's Clock, a story about a vengeful old clockmaker, Adolf Reifler, who killed his adulterous wife and turned her into an automaton forced to hourly course along a track in a giant clock tower display. The spire was allegedly located in an old flooded area in the neighboring state of Massachusetts, in a place called the Quabbon. Rob had gone on long jogs through the woods there during the summer, and he'd allegedly heard the bells of the Phantom Tower, still sticking out of the water in the distance. He'd asked Flesh to bring him back there to go hear the bells, only for the excursion to go terribly, as Rob ventured out to the spire. He never said what he saw, but it got to the point that he took his own life. Alita wanted to prove that the story was real, so that she didn't have to blame herself for Rob's suicide. And the protagonist, who'd also buckled under the slightest ounce of attention from Alina, agreed. What followed was a perilous journey to investigate the spire of the woods by walking onto a frozen lake, which resulted in Scary Carrie falling through the water and ending up at the hospital with frostbite, stuck in a coma, and then coming out with an expressive aphasia, where all she could say was, "Hear sounds. Ring, ring, ring." This was paired alongside the protagonist getting closer to Alina, creepily trying to push their fraught relationship further and further, bordering on obsession and assault. He was slowly turning into Rob, and was exhibiting signs of Adolf Reifler, the clockmaker himself. It's a story about cycles, how legends are born from reality, how the truth fades over time. It's about pain, a crisis of faith in the face of the supernatural. It's got such a nuanced intersecting relationships that all build off each other. The characters are messy and make horrible selfish mistakes, and they talk like real people. I love the story because of all of that, and because it's got this real scrappy quality, where the characters are slowly trying to piece together this massive puzzle, capturing a real Goonies, Stand By Me kind of vibe. It's got everything I'm looking for in a scary story, and it has never left my mind since I heard it. I break these eras down not just because it's easier for me to group stories together and to gather my thoughts, but also because I think I was the ideal demographic to see the rise and fall of the creepypasta genre. I can run a parallel line with how the types of stories being written changed over time with how I grew up. Discovering the fandom, getting really into it, getting older and craving deeper experiences, and eventually growing into someone completely different from who first fell in love with those stories. I can tie that into the same journey of the narrators themselves. How MCP started his channel in college to archive his favorite stories, after fears that the original website would be shut down. How you can still find little notes he wrote in his old video descriptions about staying up late to record, or how he had to take a break to study for finals. Still getting giddy about new music from Mew he got to add to his latest story. You can trace that to how things turned into a business with everything from regularly scheduled uploads, to sponsored stories and book deals, to Patreon plugs at the start and end of each video. If only I had a Patreon to plug. Slowly over time, these narrators stopped feeling like curators, and more like people picking up scraps to keep their audiences engaged. I'm sure you noticed how simple, punchy titles and premises got phased out for more drawn-out titles that give everything away. And that's by design. What I call a creepypasta in the so-called modern age is so unrecognizable to the stories that first populated the web. I left out of this entire discussion some more of the new breed, specifically narration channels like the Dark Sanatorium and podcasts like Wendigoon's CreepyPasta, that have apparently siphoned a large majority of these OG channels' viewership thanks to long stories and regular uploads. But it's tricky to just accept them on their terms. I'll get into this in the next section, where I discuss how the ways people access creepypastas and internet horror have evolved over time.
But it seems like the type of creepypasta content that is proving to be the most popular right now is still those Reddity, no-sleep stories that play Mad Libs with, "I never should have gone to innocuous yet ominous location because vague lore / rule / curse is real" structure, stretching themselves over the 6-hour mark sometimes needlessly, with the narrator reading things very flatly and monotone. The thumbnails and titles are so vaguely spooky that they are interchangeable, mostly irrelevant to the content. Meanwhile, Creepcast is almost exclusively covering famous stories from the past 10 years in a hybrid narration / commentary talkback format, again going upwards of 4 hours for a single story. It's second screen content first and foremost, meant to be digested in a casual way. The immersion is stripped away entirely, leaving some pretty threadbare offerings on display. Even in its most remainingly pure form, creepypasta is no longer meant to be engaged with earnestly, immersively.
And so the question we're left with is, do we even call this a creepypasta? Or has it evolved into something else? Well, let's look at semantics. This isn't a retrospective in the traditional sense. As mentioned previously, I fell off the community several times over the course of several years, but I kept coming back every once in a while to check in. Not just because I'd grown attached, but because I wanted that same feeling back of the intimate nights alone with nothing but a bright computer screen and a dark room. It was a feeling you couldn't mimic. That was gone, and that's something you can't control. Part of this was due to the splintering of the fandom. Some people just came for the scary stories and the creativity, but other younger fans saw these characters as a means of self-expression. Jenny Nicholson, once again, a beacon in the fandom analysis world, showed how you can draw a short line between Jeff the Killer's burned black hair, bleached skin, and cut eyelids to a scene haircut, goth Twilight skin, and eyeliner. Jeff is just one example of how a creepypasta character was overtaken by the fandom to become an e-boy. So many of these characters become representative of their audience. They become like action figures to place next to each other and interact. They all live in a spooky hype house style mansion in the woods and go on dates to murder innocent victims. Probably. That sounds like it would happen. But it creates a divide in the fandom on what a certain character should be, and what the tone of everything should be. Should it go back to the gore and shock value of the early days? Or should the audience be responsible for shaping its image in the modern day? That's where I first saw an interesting evolution in the creepypasta community. You may have noticed that I left out one glaring omission from the pantheon of famous creepypasta monsters. And there's a reason for that. I think Slenderman is an entity unto himself. What he started out as and what he flourished into represents its own unique side of the creepypasta fandom, one which stood for the sense of community, collaboration, and outright destroying the wall of Artifice for good and ill. And besides, like any good essayist, I keep what you're coming for until later in the video. The character of the Slenderman was created in 2009 by Eric Knudsen, username Victor Surge, on the Something Awful forums for their Create Paranormal Images contest. He released a couple photoshopped images with tall, spindly figure in a seemingly black suit with a pale blank face. He added some supplementary text to the images that tease the creature's intentions, how it overpowers its victims, children, how its long arms act like tendrils to suck them in and convince them to do its bidding, or they just simply vanish. Slenderman was quite literally a blank slate, onto which anyone who came across him could contribute something new to his ambiguous mythos. This spawned more images from the users on the site, lore tidbits like common sightings of the woods, and this would naturally expand to transmedia projects. Just weeks after the original posts, users Troy Wagner and Joseph Delage decided to take Slenderman into a whole new medium, launching a YouTube channel called Marble Hornets, which would create nearly 90 episodes over the course of several seasons in a found footage format, with the person behind the channel piecing the videos together to tell the story of a failed student film that was infiltrated by the operator, a parasitic variant of the Slenderman that latched onto the film's director, Alex Crayley, and proceeded to use him as a proxy to feed off of everyone else involved in the production. There's a couple very tremendous full retrospectives of the series on the site, users like Nightmine, Sagan Hawks, and more essay-style content from Valeria Santiago. It's a lot more condensed and easy to digest than watching the original work, which, to be honest, hasn't aged perfectly, if not for the shaky acting, then for the nature of the ARG. The multiple channels talking to each other, and the still unsolved puzzles and hidden codes that have since likely been abandoned. The additions to the mythos here are unparalleled. The glitching effect on the video, the concept of mind control, and a slender sickness that infects the proxies, and even the key locations of the first season of Marble Hornets got added to the jump scare game everyone has at least seen someone play before, Slender the 8 Pages. New series popping up that weren't necessarily derivative of Marble Hornets, but certainly taking elements and expanding on them. Tribe 12, Everyman Hybrids, Dan Frederick, and so many others would all riff off of each other. Many more creators eventually meeting up in person and even crossing over into each other's video series. At all times, Slenderman represented a supernatural and vengeful entity, a metaphor for trauma, a cold and uncaring being above understanding. People took this character and ran with it, and inspired a creative drive to go out and create more art. I use all that as a preface to illustrate how, from the beginning, Slender Man, on his own, despite the ambiguity, was tangible. Everything about him was understandable at a glance. Every person who would come to contribute to the Slender Man mythos was basically a part of a large running inside joke, keeping the illusion alive in increasingly convincing ways. Because when that artifice is shattered, when art exists beyond the art's point, to create, to inspire, to impact, and it is viewed without context or intent, it can become too real. In 2014, two 12-year-old girls named Morgan Geyser and Anissa Weir took a friend of theirs into the woods behind one of their homes and proceeded to stab her with a kitchen knife 19 times. This act was premeditated, the girls having fallen into the illusion that they needed to do this to appease the fictional character of Slender Man. An old associate professor of mine did a wonderful nonfiction piece about this incident, placing herself in the heads of the girls and seeing how they could have made themselves fall for this delusion. I've linked it below. But the facts of the case remain that the natural progression of the art form demanded the dismantling of its constraints as a form of art in the first place, which nearly ended the life of a young girl. I don't want to diminish the real tragedy or conflate changing art style as something dangerous to your children, but when you're constantly chasing that next level of immersion, of depth, the chance to be taken seriously, you lose what made you, you. It's the classic ship of Theseus conundrum. You lose control of an idea or a practice and it mutates. You link that to how we got from the golden age to the modern age. In my issues with creepypasta's evolutions, it's no longer just that the stories insist on removing the artifice. It's that the artifice was the whole appeal in the first place. Because without it, it becomes something else entirely. Unfiction. I keep coming back to something Chris Duckman said in his review of Skinamarink, talking about an opportunity he received to pitch a script to a studio looking to capitalize on an unnamed creepypasta IP. And he tried to explain that the only way to faithfully capture the feeling of that character would be to shoot in a very lo-fi way, leaving lost to the imagination and hiding the horror in the shadows and blurred in the background. Creepypasta was always designed to be accessible, but not always be understood. There was always a barrier that kept readers safe, and the stories from becoming something they weren't. And so you think that analog horror would be the answer to everything I've had issues with in the modern creepypastas, and the dangers of unfiction, whittling down all these disparate elements and convoluted, frivolous narrative restrictions, down to horror's most essential parts. And it kinda does. For those unaware, analog horror is better described as a new format rather than any specific evolution of creepypasta as a genre. It generally features an old analog format like 4:3 aspect ratio, static, distorted audio and visuals, and tends to tell stories through deep frying still images and vaguely hinting at a greater story through text and narration, almost as if coming from a broadcast announcer or through commercials. The conceit of this being a real tape is easily and very often broken with characters in the story communicating through text on screen, having random visuals spliced into various shots to scare viewers. It's all meant to evoke a disquieting feeling of nostalgia, bringing you back to a place where not everything in the world had a reasonable explanation yet. Some of the most famous series that I'm aware of include Local 58, created by the same guy who created Candle Cove, Chris Straub, which comprises a series of news broadcasts warning of an alien invasion or something. There's the Mandela Catalog, created by Alex Kirsten, which tells the story of a demonic or alien invasion of sorts. It's different because this one features these monsters called alternates, which try to assume the identities of their victims. And there's also the Walton Files, created by Martin Walls, which basically tells the complicated story of a totally not Five Nights at Freddy's restaurant and a series of murders and human backstabbing drama. Not to be confused with the actual FNAF analog horror series. While yes, these were bringing back the feeling of discomfort and ambiguity of early creepypastas, there's just something about analog horror that rubs me the wrong way. For starters, in an effort to bring things back to their earlier days, there's no jump scare or payoff. These stories are more about lingering feelings they leave you with. And so often that method bleeds into everything else. Ongoing stories that stretch themselves too thin, focusing on hidden lore above everything else, and leaving all meaning up to the community to interpret. There's also the same dribble of formulaic presentation, which was already clear in the few examples I just showed. It's more so pulling from a specific genre of horror, playing off a single inherent primal fear as its baseline, like liminal spaces, here being the unsettling nature of analog video. But still, the VHS format on YouTube is incongruent with the platform. It lacks the realism of those old allegedly haunted videos, which were described as having just been circulated on the internet. They were tied directly in with the medium they were a part of. Sure, these series are interesting as a premise, things like Petscop and the Backrooms that have all this lore buried beneath the surface that invite you to come a little closer to learn what it is. You can appreciate it as a story, or really as a puzzle box. But when horror gets an author, it's immediately tied down to its restrictions. Authors can create book and movie deals. Authors can speak directly with their audience. Authors can provide comfort and security. They plainly point out the artificial barrier between the story and the audience. It's the worst of both worlds. Speaking about the backrooms, I think that's an interesting case study in how such a simple image with a block of text can be transposed over so many different ideas, be given so much hidden lore, different factions, entities, organizations in control of one of the literal hundreds of floors of this liminal space. The internet remains more vast and infinite than it ever was, and still has no limit as to who can post what, and so these pieces can become collaborative. But here, it's gotten so far out of control, it is everything I hate about modern horror. Everything is additive, but has to work together like bad improv. Ever since Lost, we've replaced deeper connection and meaning with more time spent on something. The more something is overexposed, the less scary it is, the less intriguing that it can be. That's not to say that analog horror is the wrong answer, because on the other end of the spectrum, we have what Steckman warned against, commercialization. There are two prime examples for how the creepypasta world has been taken over and exploited by Hollywood for a quick buck, in effect losing all of its allure. One is a controversial take, and the other is universally hated, so I'll start with the easy one. Slenderman is a 2018 film written by David Burke and directed by Sylvian White. I've already talked at length about the Slenderman mythos and all the good and bad that spawned from it, and still, even the worst of that was more interesting than this 90-minute movie, which is no joke tied as my least favorite film of all time, right behind Vanilla Sky, that pretentious piece of shit. Sure, there was a cheap and fast attempt to get a Slender movie out with Always Watching, a Marble Hornets story, a spin-off found footage tale loosely set in the Marble Hornets universe, banking primarily off the name value. But I don't count that as a real movie, so let's get back to the forgotten Sony slop. This film does away with anything that made the original character, or what it became, appealing. It is one of the most incomprehensible things I've ever seen. The lighting is abysmal throughout. For the first 15 minutes, there is literally nothing established, and it's almost impossible to tell what the genre even is. And the characters continue making some of the most illogical decisions I've seen in a horror movie. But much of that probably comes down to the editing. So much of the film is cut down in order to keep a PG-13 rating to the point where plot lines are suddenly dropped. And it all ends on one of the most tone-deaf notes I've seen. This closing monologue about how Slenderman is all around us, and he might even inspire you to do bad things like stab your friend. It's horribly tasteless. But on the other end of the spectrum, you get something like Channel Zero, a 4-season anthology series for sci-fi that sought to more faithfully adapt some of the most popular creepypasta series, using one for the skeleton of each season. Its first 3 being based on stories I've already talked about in detail. Season 1 being Candle Cove, Season 2 being No End House, and Season 3 being Search and Rescue Woods. The premise was intriguing, and despite being poorly marketed for a show already geared towards a niche audience on a small network, I had hope for the adaptation. But these are not faithful adaptations. The series takes maybe some of the most ambiguous, bone-chilling stories and gave them a definitive plot. I hate how the in-universe show of Candle Cove has a canon explanation for existing, or how No In House is literally actually a metaphor for trauma and it consumes you and it makes your worst fears become part of the house or whatever. I didn't care for that season that much. The original story of No In House had multiple sequel chapters by the original author, and they did the exact same thing. They were either a retread of the original, or they tried to explain the magic. Either way, Channel Zero takes the IP name, but so loosely tries to tie itself to the original story. At which point you're left asking, why didn't they just make this an original story? The plots are a lot more predictable, standard. Meanwhile, in the film space, horror movies evolved from exploitative slashers to cheap found footage to tamed studio features, all the way up through the psychological metaphor horror phase, as I like to call it. Films that lean more towards the artistic and abstract, focusing on visceral and enigmatic imagery, slower building tension, and scares that seem to represent something deeper on a thematic or character level. Think Hereditary, Midsummer, The Witch, Lighthouse, The Babadook, Haunting of Hill House, basically anything released by A24. They're really steering the ship here. More specifically, that space has been dominated by religious horror. Just look in the past year. Longlegs, Late Night with the Devil, Immaculate, The First Omen, Heretic, Maxine. And in earlier years, Saint Maud, 2 Exorcist movies. It's the same journey I track with how creepypasta evolved as I and the medium aged over time. And just like that, the tropes of the genre become stale, eventually. I've tried escaping the fresh evolution that slowly turned to banality by jumping back into creepypasta adjacent media, seeing if it evolved with the times. But it just stopped where I'd left it, letting more traditional tropes and new formats like analog horror take its place. Creepypasta in traditional media is either represented as something learning the ropes of metaphor horror with analog elements a la Skinamarink, or it's stuck as a crappy teen horror movie like Slender Man or The Bye Bye Man or Truth or Dare or Wish Upon. Creepypasta is too big of a subculture to continue to exist as it once was, but it's still looked down upon as if it was still in its early years to be taken seriously on its own terms without having to add some qualifier or tying it into some existing tropes for mass markets to understand, or a new format like No Sleep or analog horror. Even the big three channels fell off to some regard. CreepyPasta got outed for allegedly grooming an underage fan. His face reveal was funny enough. Also his 40-minute "I'm sorry, I did nothing wrong though" video addressing it all. He still posts regularly, but it's the same sort of vague dribble with generic thumbnails. CreepyPasta Jr. stopped posting altogether randomly in the middle of 2021, after taking a step back to maybe one upload every couple weeks. His style never changed from the 10-minute Reddit no sleep story of the day, but his views had dropped considerably. All of his titles and thumbnails were just interchangeable. It was no wonder it became unsustainable. And as for Mr. CreepyPasta, he's still trucking along pretty smoothly. He's branched out to include an audio podcast of every narration, but even his views have dwindled, with sporadic upload schedules that could be weeks between new stories, thanks to some personal life troubles. Talking about his role as a curator, even the smallest, most inconsequential stories back in the Silver Age would get well over 100,000 views, sometimes reaching 500k or 1 million. And now even re-records of the famous story struggle to break 50k. No matter what anybody does, CreepyPasta just isn't what it used to be. The more you dive into something, the more something is well known, discussed, examined, adopted into new mediums, plugged for its parts to repurpose in new forms, the less enigmatic and fascinating it can be. Surely someone can appreciate art for the art's sake, but when it presents as something yet to be understood, it can be anything you want it to be. Institutions in film and television that I've talked about on this very channel, like that, include Attack on Titan, The Simpsons, and the truth is that I had no idea what Wicked was about until a week before I saw the movie. I love all of these properties now, but I thought them so fascinating in the time that I didn't know everything about them. I didn't know all the jokes, the character dynamics, the big moments, so that weight of expectation meant that they could be anything I wanted them to be. I could ascribe whatever meaning to them that I wanted. Then Schrodinger's cat's box collapses into one true reality, and you're left with the cold, hard facts. No matter what, it's always a little disappointing compared to the potential of what something could be. That is what CreepyPasta was. No matter what story you stumbled across on that dark black screen, scrolling over the lines of small white text, or if you happen to catch a glance at a supposedly haunted image, the reactionary feelings that gave you were unmatched. As audiences grew up, they demanded meteor stories that retained the punchy nature of the early internet posts, but with richer characters and original stories that left you with deeper, more complex feelings of unease, until it couldn't go any further and wrapped right back around postmodern irony-infused Reddit threads. You know, taking it all in, maybe it would have been better if I didn't make this video. Maybe I shouldn't have destroyed the allure of something I cherished so much growing up. But sometimes, sharing that experience with others is what preserves that feeling of the story, more than the story itself. It's the nature of sharing an urban legend around a campfire. Those feelings of community and small circles of knowledge make hanging off of every single word even more special. I could sit here and list almost 500 of my absolute favorite stories, rank them, provide a synopsis, and generally talk about where I was when I first heard them and how they stuck with me. But that's why I have 2,000 of them all ranked in another meticulous Excel spreadsheet, and I have them all downloaded as MP3 files in custom albums in alphabetical order, and organized into different playlists depending on their subgenre, /era, /narrator, /length, /ranking, /author if it's notable. These stories mean so much to me. They're my comfort media and can directly take me back to such a specific moment in time, often paired with even more nostalgic, blissful moments of my childhood. I feel like I've heard more of Mr. CreepyPasta's voice over the years than I have some of my distant relatives. That might be slightly concerning. They represented a lot for me when I was younger, finding my own unique interests, which was something very important to me as a weird preteen trying to make myself stand out. They also helped me foster a lot of my own, admittedly bad and unproduced, writings and old short film concepts. They helped me with translating images across mediums, adapting no dialogue, stream of consciousness stories into real scripts using basic film language. Over time, I started writing direct adaptations of these stories, and eventually turned to writing my own original creepypastas, which honestly sort of lined up with how I broke down the 4 eras. Knocking was my first real attempt at writing a scary story. Mimicking the Golden Age, it was a simple and punchy story about a guy hearing typical sounds in the room above him in his college dorm, only to come back from class one day and see the place swarmed by police, as he realizes that there was a violent man living underneath the student's bed trying to communicate with him. My next story, Hoax, was a longer and more ambitious 3-part series which focused on an ensemble of kids using the names and some vague personality traits of some of my real-life high school friends and some writing exercise to flesh out some character archetypes I created. As they started their own urban legend in town, there were a series of targeted acts of vandalism, only to realize they've also brought their own monster to life in ways they didn't think possible. It still had that scrappy feel of early Silver Age stories, but with real characters and a plot with twists and turns. I was really proud of that one. It's like popcorn fluff. Suburban Legends, written years before Taylor Swift even uttered those words into existence, and yes, I will be suing, was my shift into the Bronze Age, and told another original story of two brothers that seek closure after the passing of their now distant grandfather by going to his rural southern hometown to learn more about him. However, they learned quickly that the town holds dark secrets, and their grandfather was at the center of it all. The general premise was about the nature of urban legends, naturally how stories evolve and twist over time. It stemmed back to two childhood friends exploring a mysterious field, and when one of them didn't come back, the other was blamed, fleeing in the night after seeing something supernatural in the field. It was a story about obsession and grief, and that's certainly not easy to pitch to a friend. Not to mention that it's 7 chapters and 2 hours long. But my modern age entry, No Rest, I feel blows all of them out of the water. This was the product of me revisiting a story that I thought I'd loved from the Golden Age, Case File number 56, which was so much cheaper and poorly written than I thought it was when I was a kid. I thought the premise of The Sinner still had potential. A supernatural detective thriller that sees two partners and friends torn apart as they appear more and more outmatched. The skeleton of a real story was there, but it had no substance. And so I put together a from the ground up reimagining that took several of the same elements and plot points and merely shuffled them around. For instance, the random computer user that Ryan and John recruit to lure the monster over Skype, Repetitive Routine, is here under the same pen name, and his fate is the same. His relationship to Ryan as a tool or a pawn remains the same, but the context and backstory is fleshed out tremendously to give them both dramatic weight. Ryan still struggles with his faith in a Catholic church. He still encounters his worst nightmare on a lonely farm. And the main victims of the story retain their origins and largely the same fates, but their purpose in Ryan's story is dramatically different. I switched from a first-person POV to third-person, allowing the story to focus on multiple perspectives at a time. It seeks to give the main trio a real relationship with each other, real history that ties them in with each other for better or worse. And probably, most controversially, it pivots the primary focus from the monster and the killings to a more omnipresent, insidious force. This is a story about people, power, how the selfish, hateful actions of one person will only spawn another, while a selfless act will break the wheel forever. The monster here works as a symbol for the negligence of the characters and the cruelty of the story world. It is allowed to fester because of a larger story at play. This allows both original and new characters to have true purposes in the story, besides just being narrators or exposition machines. They have a part to play in the quest to stop this monster. It was a 6-hour, 6-chapter epic that put Ryan at the center of a police conspiracy, one where he rose to the top for pinning a crime he committed on someone he had a personal vendetta against, only for that same case to come back and haunt him a year later, as the supernatural entity in the original story has lashed itself onto him and is now claiming more victims related to his own. That's put alongside a story of police corruption and a conspiracy to cover up a massive intra-precinct drug trade. It was a metaphor for how grief can cripple somebody and how institutions can take advantage of and prey on the weak and the poor. Basically, it was The Place Beyond the Pines meets Candyman. It so radically transformed the original text that it basically became its own thing, something I'm so incredibly proud of. But it will never see the light of day. I couldn't post No Rest on the No Sleep subreddit because it's written in the third person, and that immediately disqualifies it from reaching the largest at-present audience, a community that actively seeks out these stories still. It still captures that sense of realism they strive for, human themes of connection, and ambiguity to the monster, a feeling of powerlessness. Classic good versus evil and themes of atonement are all carried over, just expanded. All of these stories are linked in the description, by the way, just in case you want to stroke my ego and indulge me. But my ultimate takeaway is that in looking to expand my writing repertoire, deepen my themes, and flesh out my characters, I lost sight of the horror inherent in the ambiguity of earlier stories. I borrowed tropes from more traditional pieces of media to legitimize my own work. It lost sight of what creepypasta represented. The hobbies I treasure most from my youth are not the things where I was part of a large team, or where I had to dedicate a lot of time to perfecting a skill. I value the things that were mine, inherently. That's a really over-the-top poetic way of saying I was one of those kids that liked to listen to weird music with his headphones in on the back of the bus. But I think it captures that feeling of adolescent identity complex pretty succinctly. I got so engrossed in this medium. It became so special to me, and I can't get back any semblance of what I once loved about it, and I miss that. But I know that's just a fraction of the content that's out there in this space. I said that no one person had the exact same experience with creepypasta, and that's absolutely true. We all have a certain style or format or general idea that spoke to us. That is the definitive version of creepypasta, and it means something different to everyone, whichever form it took. And so, while the fire is still smoldering a little bit, tell me your story.